The moon itself, the more you research the moon, the more I did. I was able to quote people a lot more expert in the subject than me who said, the more you know about the moon, the more far out and amazing it gets, and the less you really know. And even after NASA went to the moon and brought back all this information, they didn't know anything more about the moon in a sense. The moon just became more and more puzzling. One of the things we always know about the moon is that the moon, as it goes around the Earth, always keeps one face toward us. And we can never see the dark side of the moon. Now, this is a little bit unusual. I mean, it's obviously in a very special orbit around our planet for it to do that. Even more amazing is that when we have a total eclipse of the sun by the moon, and the ancient peoples like the Egyptians and the Mayans and no doubt the Chaldeans and other people, the Indians, everybody who was very much into astronomy, realized that eclipses were very important. And many of the ancient observatories were set up specifically to observe eclipses. When the moon eclipses the sun, it does so perfectly. The moon is in such a position around our planet that when the disk of the moon transits the disk of the sun is perfectly covered by the moon. Not more and not less. Now, this is pretty unusual. I mean, what I'm saying is if the moon was a little bit closer to the Earth, it would more than cover the sun. If the moon was a little bit farther away from the Earth, it would less than cover the sun. But our moon is in such a position that when it transits the disk of the sun on those rare eclipse occasions, and you have to be at certain places on the Earth to actually see this, the moon perfectly covers the sun, not more and not less. You see the sun's corona. It's a beautiful sight. And in fact, I'm told by people who have witnessed full eclipses of the sun that all kinds of amazing things happen, and the world is vibrating and colors jump out at you, and it's like being on psychedelic drugs or something. So here we go. I mean, just as a scientific fact of how amazing the moon is, that the moon is a captured planet and just arbitrarily in orbit around the Earth seems unlikely from the evidence. This is just a photo map of the moon with some of the craters. It's one of the first illustrations in the book. One of the things to note here, and this slide is not too important, is what is called the ray system on the moon. And that is the rays around the craters, and white streaks go out from the rays. Here we can start to see some of the rays coming out. And this is important because the rays on the moon are very unusual. What's often said is that, as we know, the moon is full of craters. And craters are often said to be, although most astronomers will admit they do not know how the craters on the moon are formed, they're often said to be impact craters from asteroids. It's a typical explanation. And with an impact crater, you have then what's called ejecta from the crater. And they believe that's what forms these rays. It's a diagram of some of the rays from the crater Tycho. And what it shows is how many of the rays on the moon and from the craters converge and come together. Other lines and rays from the crater don't even come from the crater itself, but come from like the side of the crater. Down here, again, we see from the mare other rays coming here and actually going from one crater to another. And once again, up here, as I'm saying, is that certain rays are parallel and come out as parallel lines. Others completely miss, others converge. In other words, the explanation that the rays on the moon, and we'll see that rays are on other planets and moons too, that their ejecta from the crater does not hold scientifically, because it's not like they're being blown out from the center of the crater. All right, this is actually a photo of the Nazca Plain in Peru. And we see how lines, Nazca Plain is famous, unusual lines going helter-skelter, oddball designs written on the plane, other lines going out in various geometric patterns and that kind of thing. Are they related to rays on the moon? Well, maybe or maybe not. There doesn't seem to actually be any purposeful design of the rays that are coming out of the crater. Coming across here and ending right here, this white spot, is a giant vehicle moving on the moon. Something like that, and it's leaving a tractor tread pattern across the moon as it moves. Now, NASA actually even did a whole document study of this thing. It was so strange. They call it a rolling rock on the moon. And there's several of them. I mean, in the appendix of my book is the entire NASA study on these things. One of their rolling rocks, because in one of the photos there's two of them, one of these rolling rocks rolls out of a crater, up and out, and then down. This is another one, and it's moving along. Again, it makes a tread pattern. It's right here. Now, according to the renegade scientists who don't believe that these are rocks rolling around on the moon, their explanation is that these are vehicles, and some of them are big, and they're moving around on the moon, and they're probably, the hypothesis is, they're mining vehicles, and they move around on the moon, mining the moon. The moon is full of rare and valuable metals: chromium, titanium, other important metals that are extremely expensive to make, and the moon crust is full of them. Now, the hypothesis is that these giant mining machines move around on the moon, literally scooping up the moon, processing the metals, throwing waste at one end, and then keeping the compacted rare metals inside. This is actually a Russian mock-up of one of their early lunar rovers that they were going to build, or actually built, to go around on the moon. Here you can see the wheels and treads, that kind of thing. So we see the kind of possible sort of vehicles that might be running around on the moon. On the moon are bottomless craters, literally. Other craters are craters within side craters. You can see here, this is actually a drawing of what is like a ladder-type object, and the next photo is actually of this crater, going down inside this crater. Now, there are literally craters on the moon they can't find bottoms to. One theory on the moon is that the moon is hollow. Now, when different stages of the Apollo landing module, they would drop rocket stages on the moon when they were done with them, and they would crash onto the moon. And the moon continued to ring like a bell for hours and vibrate. NASA does not like to admit or even speculate that the moon is hollow. By going through the so-called bottomless craters on the moon, you will enter inside it. Now, how would you make a hollow moon? How could a moon like ours be created in that way if it was? And along with all this, and many of the authors on the moon, of the more esoteric books, shall we say, speculated that, yeah, the moon is an artificial spaceship, our moon. And also that maybe other moons are also artificial spaceships too, and they're all hollow. Now, how would you make one of these moons? One way to do it would be you go out to the asteroid belt, get yourself a nice big hunk of asteroid, superheat it with whatever devices you've got, thermonuclear bombs or certain wave weaponry, so you've got like a molten blob of asteroid rock in space, and then just like a glass blower blows a glass ball, you blow yourself a giant hollow moon. And as that moon cools, it will take on a glassy appearance, the whole thing, it's been molten. And you will have dark patches like Maria. You will have cracks, things like that in the moon. And in theory, you're going to want various craters and things like that so that you can come and go from inside the moon. All right, this is the slide with the hollow moon and the bottomless crater, which is this one down here. It's not going to be too, there, that was pretty good. You can actually see at the bottom of this, and George Leonard in his book, Somebody Else is on the Moon, went into quite a bit of detail on this. In this bottomless crater, which I can't find a bottom to, there is then an object, which we had the drawing on the page before, of it going, the ladder, but it's huge, almost like a skyscraper, and you can see it looks like a giant ladder moving down inside this crater. When I started researching about the moon and cities on the moon, objects on the moon, I found that even back to the earliest moon maps and the earliest astronomers, they were all saying that, yeah, there are cities on the moon, there are strange craters full of domed cities and things like that, canals, similar as they believed on Mars. This is a map from like mid-1600s. Several of the early astronomers, one was a German named Grüthesen, and then later a French astronomer named Godebert. Also, by now they're looking through the moon in large telescopes from national observatories and things. They found what they called a city on the moon. But they drew illustrations. They appeared in all the astronomical journals of the time. Later now they find that the crater, that these structures that they had drawn is even gone. And this became part of the whole story on the moon, is that craters suddenly appear, other craters disappear. One of the hypotheses to all this is that the moon is being mined. And the actual origin of many of the craters is not impact craters of asteroids, but they are literally open pit mines done as craters. This was called Modeler's Square, another city on the moon drawn by early astronomers. And it was a city that was like squared. This was something that even today, as you get into the Monuments of Mars kind of books and things, they're looking for oddball angles in on Mars, on the moon. Early astronomers would say, well, here's a city laid out, walls of a city, that kind of thing. So it's looking at these for unusual formations and usually geometrical patterns that makes astronomers and other people say, this is not a natural structure, this is something artificial. This is actually the crater Lynn. This probably isn't going to come up all that well. And this is one of the craters too that had lines going through it and roads and things like that. Finally, eventually, the crater itself disappeared and was just simply not visible anymore. The crater Darwin, which is what these are of. This is a comparison of various illustrations for the crater Darwin. Astronomers constantly looked at this one. It was an easy crater to see, and what they kept mapping was all kinds of different roads and maps and lines crossing the crater. These seem to change constantly. Okay, now on the moon are many what they call riles and rivulets, coming and going from craters. Here we can see a good one here, moving along, this kind of thing. Now, NASA geologists have looked at this and have wondered, okay, what are these things? Are there rivers on the moon? This is what they look like. Their only explanation for these things is that they could be lava flows from the early formation of the moon, or possibly cracks in the moon themselves. Now, a jet propulsion engineer who was of German nationality and moved to Los Angeles, he wrote a book that Adventures Unlimited sells called We Discovered Alien Bases on the Moon. And he actually proposed in his book and provided evidence, and we'll see some more slides coming up, that there is water on the moon, there are rivers on the moon, there's irrigation on the moon, and there's even terraced farming on the moon. And you get into the whole thing, which gets back to Apollo missions, of what it's like on the moon. Whether, can you just get out of your spaceship and start walking on the moon, even breathing the air? According to NASA, you can't. But according to other researchers on the moon, you can. Even the whole gravity of the moon and, again, clouds on the moon, water, atmosphere, is a big question. Astronauts have reported clouds on the moon. Astronomers have reported clouds on the moon and clouds drifting across craters. Absolutely, the moon is some kind of desert environment that's not at all, certainly not some lake district or something like that. But there is evidence that certain craters are flooded with water at certain times for irrigation, that there are canals between craters. This is a huge feature called the straight wall, and it starts here, moves right up, and it's perfectly straight, and it's like a giant, huge gap. And it's the way a lot of structures are seen on the moon and Mars and other planets is simply by the shadows that they cast. So this is actually a drawing done of the straight wall, and no one really has a good explanation for what this thing is. It could be a giant, like, hangar wall that, again, goes inside the moon. It's hard to say. No one's ever been able to see the face of this thing. Maybe there isn't one. Other ideas are that when the moon was formed, even as an artificial structure, it was ripped. This is like a big rip in the moon, perfectly straight. Others have also theorized that devastating wars have been fought on the moon, and that, again, the straight wall is part of that. No one really has a good explanation for that. One of the craters which astronomers had for a long time looked at and thought was extremely unusual was the crater Gassendi, which is this one here. Gassendi is on this side of the moon that faces us. And for the last 100 years, this crater in particular has been the focus of what is called transient lunar light phenomenon. And at times, this entire crater has been lit up by rays of light, what appear to be giant searchlights. All right, this is a diagram made by one of the early astronomers of Gassendi, and according to them, and again, these are mainstream astronomers who are doing these studies, that this whole area of Gassendi coming up here was all lit up. So we start to see, I mean, there's a pattern that flows on all this material on the moon of lights on the moon, strange tracks on the moon, rays of this dust streaming out from craters. To this day, even in mainstream astronomy, the whole subject of light phenomena on the moon is well known, and it can't be explained. The traditional explanation would be something to the effect of what's called piezoelectric phenomenon, where plates or rocks there's a pressure on them, Like if you take two crystals or you take a quartz crystal and you put pressure on it, light will be emitted from it. That's more of a traditional explanation of light phenomena on the moon. As I began researching the book on the moon, I found that there were pyramids on the moon. And one of them, the most interesting one I could find, was a crater called Astounding, which is this crater right here. And on this crater was a little network of about 7 perfectly made pyramids. There are obelisks on the moon too, and other unusual structures like this. One of the slides that we missed earlier was of what's called the Blair cuspids, which are also a series of 7 obelisks standing on the moon with the shadows. This is a photo which, from the Apollo 8, that Fred Steckling, the German who wrote the book Alien Bases on the Moon, what he noticed was that this is the backside of the moon. This is a color photo. The whole backside of the moon is like is all red. He called it autumn colors. He felt that at the time this photo was taken, the whole backside of the moon was covered in vegetation. What he particularly pointed out was right here, 3 lines or terraces, and felt that this was terracing on the moon as part of irrigation projects that were being done on the moon. The moon authors have often claimed that what's going on around the edge of this crater, particularly up here, are clouds. And when you compare the two photos together, you see more detail, particularly in this area, in one photo than you do in the other. And it's because, they claim, just clouds are hanging along this edge of this crater rim. Many illustrations and drawings have been done, particularly by British astronomers. In fact, they have a whole club there at Yale and Oxford of these guys who are very good artists and sketch unusual things on the moon. Yale has published a whole volume in these books and illustrations. This is an interesting one here because you can clearly see a pyramid. Right here this is in the book too, of course, is a pyramid, and it's casting a pyramid shadow. It's often been claimed that there are these domed cities on the moon. And some of the early UFO people like George Adamski and a guy named Howard Menger, a few others, claimed they went to the moon and brought back photos of the moon and saying that, well, yeah, I've been to the moon and this is what it's like there, and there are these domed cities on the moon. NASA itself has released a number of photographs that, and again, these domed cities, these so-called domes on the moon, which curiously also appear and disappear. If you read the book, even mainstream astronomers get into this mystery. There's a crater called Plato, too, that would have domes in it sometimes. Other times they wouldn't be able to see these domes. I suppose other explanations for this would be somehow why these rounded, eroded hills. There shouldn't be any real erosion on the moon. Allegedly, there's no wind, there's no water. This was a diagram of how I was talking about how the mountains can be created. These are the mountains within a crater, and the pyramid peaks. Just one idea of how they would be created in a natural formation sense. Here we see some other unusual craters, again apparently showing what might be mining activity of a crater within a crater, a bullseye crater. With one crater and then the second one inside. This was actually the cover photo used in Fred Steckling's book about alien bases on the moon. This is a NASA photograph taken from one of the lunar orbiters showing the moon in the background and what is apparently a cigar-shaped elongated craft moving over the moon. Now these were the craft, the same kind of craft that George Leonard claimed were creating the mysterious rays on the moon. As they would lift up, cover with a white dust, move from one crater to another, this dust would drop down, creating the various rays. Moon lights, including a discoid craft coming from the moon. It's a pretty interesting one too, another NASA photo showing an elongated glowing object on the moon. A kind of mist, cloud is actually coming off it to one side. Maybe even the dust, the white dust that we're talking about, is creating the rays. Howard Menger was another 50s UFO nut, claimed he had been to the moon, that kind of thing. He wrote a book called From Outer Space to You in 1959. So if there are domed cities, what I found as I started researching my books too, was that back in the early 60s, there were all kinds of diagrams of underground cities on the moon and what it was going to be like when we got there. On Mars too. And this is from a 1961, like NASA book about the moon. And here they said, yeah, we'll live underground, we'll live in these domes. Like 12 men will live inside, these facilities on the moon. This was what they were saying in 1961. But 30 years later, they weren't talking about anything like that, or ever mentioning any kind of proposed installations on the moon. Here we go too, the crater Langrenus. It turns out that if you can get a photograph of the moon at just the right time, usually when just at sunset or sunrise on the moon, to catch these domes on the moon, it's what it took. Because here we can see the whole craters in darkness, and just the sun is at an extremely low angle, and the domes are catching the light. Now, even when we get into what it's like on the moon and the Apollo missions, we find that what NASA's been telling us and what they say it's like on the moon, what they say they did there, even photographs that they say are of the moon and astronauts on the moon, suddenly become into question. We start to think, well, we can't really believe what they say. And certainly, I've found that, when it comes to what the U.S. government says, what the CIA says, what Senate investigation committees ultimately decide, it's not trustworthy. And in the end, when you look at the Apollo missions, there are some glaring anomalies that they just simply don't address. And they are addressed in a book, which is very hard to get, called Moongate, the NASA military cover-up. It was published by a NASA engineer who worked for NASA. And he came up with some pretty good criticisms of the moon missions and what was really going on. Now, right around the time, just after the moon missions, a number of people, and they, curiously, all NASA employees, or former NASA employees, started publishing these books about the moon, about NASA. One book actually was entitled, We Never Went to the Moon, and they claimed that the moon missions were entirely fake. So, what people were saying was, well, did NASA somehow fake the moon missions? Did we really go to the moon? Apparently, what people like Bill Bryan of Moongate say, that it's a mixture of, yes, we went to the moon, but also we faked it at the same time, in the sense that allegedly many of the photos of the moon and astronauts of the moon were pre-filmed. But he maintains that we did go to the moon too. But he also says that when we went to the moon and the kind of technology used to go to the moon, particularly of the lunar module itself, was not rocket technology. Now, NASA themselves released their own artist drawings of what it was going to be like when they landed on the moon, and this is merely a NASA artist's conception of the lunar module landing on the moon. What's important to notice here is the big rocket plume coming out of the bottom of the lunar module. The module itself is landing in this drawing because it has the legs. This is a photo of the lunar module landing on the moon. Do you see any kind of blast or rocket exhaust coming out of the bottom of it? No, it's not there. Well, maybe it might still be there. But still, there's a problem with what NASA said they did when they went to the moon. And that is, when the lunar module got to the moon, and particularly if this was a rocket-powered vehicle, as it settled on the moon, the moon has dust on it, of course. What it should have created what is called a blast crater. In other words, well, I mean, take a rocket, even a homemade one, and set it up on the Earth and then fire it off. I mean, it's going to create a crater underneath anywhere. I mean, even if you did it on a tarmac road, it would just burn a hole in the road. On the lunar module, and any photo that you can find of the lunar module on the moon, there is no blast crater underneath the module. One of the interesting things, too, and anomalies about the moon, is that the moon is supposedly 4.4 billion years old. Now, at a Swedish university, they began doing tests on what they call cosmic dust. And that is that dust is everywhere in the cosmos, and they've actually come up with a rate that dust settles on the Earth. And every year, so many tons of dust settle on the Earth. And that dust, because we have an atmosphere here, it's washed down into the rivers and into the ocean, and that's where the cosmic dust is, from the Earth. But on the moon, there isn't supposedly wind. There isn't supposed to be water or an atmosphere. Therefore, allegedly, 4.4 billion years of cosmic dust has been gathering on the moon. And according to studies, there should be cosmic dust should be 80 feet deep on the moon, if the moon is 4.4 billion years old. And in fact, the early NASA engineers and people worried about this. They didn't know what it was like on the moon. And they wondered if astronauts would just settle into 80 feet of dust. And the craft just swallowed up. Well, it's clear by the first footprint, supposedly on the moon, there is not 80 feet of dust on the moon. About 2 inches of dust. Now, what this might mean is, well, the rate of cosmic dust is somehow just miraculously, exponentially accelerated very quickly. So there's only been 2 inches of dust falling in 4.4 billion years. Or another interesting explanation is that the moon is not 4.4 billion years old, but has only been in orbit around our planet for 20,000 years or 100,000 years or something like that. Another explanation is that there is an atmosphere on the moon and dust blows around, although there would still be a lot of dust on the moon if the moon was that old. Okay, they're setting up the flag on the moon. In some of the film footage that you see of them on the moon, you see the flag actually moving and waving. Again, that's not supposed to be. There's not a wind on the moon, they say. There's no atmosphere there. What they claim, what NASA claims is that, I mean, if you look at this photo, it looks like it is waving. They were supposed to extend a perfectly straight flag. The flag on the moon is supposed to be absolutely straight and square, not like some flapping flag. Their explanation for the appearing to be flapping is that it was a telescopic rod that came out which didn't fully extend, and so therefore you get a fold in the flag and it appears to flap. But in video footage, interestingly, you see the flag actually flapping and moving. Researchers have used this to insinuate that, yeah, there's wind on the moon. There's an atmosphere there. Here we go. Moon rover running around on the moon. You can see dust coming back. Interesting to think that maybe some of the rays and things on the moon are actually created by vehicles. There's an area of the moon, too, where they called these tunnels, and that was these two craters called the Messier 1 and 2. And the two craters were together. Again, they couldn't find bottoms to either of the craters. They look so similar to each other. Many craters on the moon are extremely sharp craters. Rather than just being a shallow bowl, they're like very deep. And a number of British astronomers proposed that there had to be a tunnel on the moon. And this tunnel went from one crater to another crater. And now, since the mainstream astronomers were saying, well, there are tunnels on the moon, now they had to explain, well, how would a tunnel on the moon be naturally formed? And what they came up with was a meteor strike coming in at a low angle, suddenly striking a mountain on the moon, and literally kind of being deflected by some hard thing in the crust, and coming out the other end and creating a tunnel on the moon. If you think that the moon is maybe inhabited, or that there are actual mining operations, things like that going on the moon, then you would have another explanation of why there are tunnels on the moon, or even the whole subject, again, of bottomless craters and things like that. Now, George Leonard claimed that also moving around on the moon were what he called X-drones. And these were these huge contraptions, artificial, like these, that move around on the moon. And they were like huge, flexible pipe kind of machines in a type X formation that processed metals and other things on the moon. He claimed also that there were areas of the moon where you could see these things. Also, were there areas of the moon where there were like bridges and other unusual things, almost like they were stitching the moon. He came up with his theory in his book, Somebody Else is on the Moon, that the moon was being repaired. More of his X-drones coming here. One of the things he claimed that these X-drones did was, this would be in craters, they create a spray coming out of the crater. And in part of the mining operations, here's also one of these X-drones just spraying this dust out of the crater. Again, that might be one of the things about the rays, the mysterious rays with the craters, is that there are areas where the rays are feathered, what they call a feathering of the rays. That George Leonard would probably explain that as having to do something with these drones on the moon that actually spray moon soil out of the crater. More of George Leonard's drawings of giant constructions on the moon. You'll notice that in the book, a lot of the British astronomers, too, that were drawing areas of the moon, came up with what were these like cross-type runways or other areas of the moon like this. George Leonard was a very big believer in that just huge areas of the moon are giant pieces of this artificial satellite. That the moon would almost be is a spaceship. And maybe in the Star Wars trilogy again, that's what they do in the first episode. In the last episode, they try and do it again, is build what they call the Death Star in space and put it around this planet. Here's one of the drawings by a guy named Howard Hill, an astronomer in Britain. And this is particularly interesting because here you see the perfectly straight cross. Actually, looks like an Egyptian ankh that had a circular like field at the end, or a crater. It's crossed at perfectly right angles like this. And I found that a lot of the British astronomers were totally fascinated by all these unusual features all over the moon, and then would draw them. And then Yale published them in Oxford, I should say, published them in this book of drawings of the moon, without comments. Another drawing by Howard Hill and published by Oxford, where the crater area of Heraclitus, too, with huge platforms on the moon, other areas where craters seem to be dug out. This area here is like a big angular platform. Fred Steckling points that out in his book, and there's quite a few photos in my book on extraterrestrial archaeology, where what appear to be huge kind of mesas or platforms built out into craters or from the outer edge of a crater going back. These would be apparently just large landing areas that are flat and level for craft to land. It's curious, too, that at Apollo 15, the astronauts went to this rock outcrop, and that was about 8 meters high. And it was very unusual because it was of essentially large blocks of stone fitted together. And if you go to Peru or Bolivia and see the giant ruins, say in the Andes, and these things are all over the world, that's what this lower photo is of, the Sacsayhuaman fortress above Cuzco, you see what are artificial and gigantic walls, 8 meters high or more, that are very similar to walls they've found on the moon. This is, in fact, Mercury. And in my book, too, we're now going to leave the moon. We're sort of winding things up here. We'll go to a few of the other planets. The more you look at Mercury, Mercury is very similar to the moon and has also rayed craters. And we'll see even like some pyramids and things like that. But Mercury seems identical to the moon. And in fact, often if you're shown photographs of Mercury, you would easily confuse them as possibly of our moon. But it's interesting to look at the rayed craters that are on Mercury and on other moons of our solar system, particularly in light of the theories of George Leonard and those of what creates these rays on the moon and other moons too. This is Mercury again, including pyramid-type objects in the center of craters. Up here too. Even some of the craters are like the bullseye craters again. They're a crater, but then they're domed. Even NASA geologists have remarked on the unusual cratering of Mercury. Here, unusual cracks and things like that. This is an unusual photo also of a crater on Mercury of what appears to be two pyramidical peaks in this crater, both casting perfectly triangular shadows in the crater. Right here. Here are the two pyramids, and here's the shadow, and here's another shadow too. Mercury was early on mapped, and with also like the moon, different ray patterns here on Mercury with oddball geometric forms and lines moving around Mercury. Venus too. I mean, supposedly, according to ancient Hindus and other esoteric writing, at least at one point in their history, almost all the planets have been inhabited, or something goes on there. Venus too has been allegedly the site of many different UFO knots. People like George Adamski and others have often claimed that, yeah, these guys were from Venus. Lobsang Rampa, that English so-called Tibetan guy who wrote those third eye books and stuff, he claimed in one of his oddball books that he'd been to Venus and that there was a civilization there, of course. Anyway, and the more NASA told us about Venus, I mean, the story changed constantly, and which I found interesting. Not that I know that much about Venus, but originally they said that, well, Venus is this sea of ammonia and stuff like that, and Carl Sagan had some idea where they were going to seed Venus and try and create a terrestrial atmosphere. But then after the Russians got to Venus and our own space probes, they found that Venus wasn't an ocean planet, but had land and continents and everything, and structures and pyramids and craters. This is a map of the continents and things on Venus. Even what appear to be continent regions and oceans, who knows? I've decided, in my researches, to be pretty skeptical about what they say. I find that a lot of the material on the moon, at least in the early stages, was valid, and that the information that came out really apparently was what they had discovered. But then later they kind of clammed up because it was all such anomalous material. And what they found out about the moon was just so amazing, they just kind of shut up about it. Another map of Venus, what it's like. An odd-shaped crater with a hill in it that even NASA pulled out as an unusual photo. Picture of Venus, what it's like, covered with cloud. I mean, it's quite possible Venus is very much like the Earth, although allegedly higher temperatures. As you go to the outer planets, Saturn and Jupiter, Neptune, Uranus, you also begin you look at the moons, and this is what I found really fascinating as I became totally absorbed with our own moon. And then as I looked at moons on Saturn and Jupiter, they became just as amazing. Now, one of the things to note here, this is actually a composite photo, but this is a real photo of the moon, the Saturn moon Dion, and that is craters like this and this. And just as interesting is this crater here on this other Saturn moon, Io. Now look at this crater, is particularly unusual. If you can see it, it's a huge crater. And the moons are relatively small, too, in these places. Now what I call these craters is umbilical craters. And in many cases of these outer moons, the craters are huge. I mean, they're so big as to be a large percentage of the actual surface of these moons. And the idea that these are impact craters from some asteroid hitting these moons is not very tenable, really. And rather, I feel, the evidence is there that the craters like this and like that are, again, what they call umbilical craters, and craters that were created in the formation of these moons. And that formation is one of, as I theorized before, a glass blower blowing glass and creating what will be an artificial spherical structure. The red deserts of Mars, an ancient planet that once had many oceans and seas, but over the millennia has been drying up. Here we see Mars and the North Polar area all lit up. It was often said that this is an ice cap reflecting the sun, although some people have theorized that Mars is hollow. And here we actually see a hole at the pole at Mars and light shining out. What it's like on Mars, the rocks and rubble. Canyons of Mars. The pictures from outside the Viking explorer of Mars. Looking at Mars, it's interesting to look at some of these blocks. The one there on the right seems kind of squared. People have commented on the N-shaped or horseshoe-shaped letter or chipping on this one rock right on the left side in the center. Here we see two photos, one top, one bottom, of what appear to be lines and striations on Mars, also compared with those at Nazca. Here we see the famous face on Mars, and all around it, on the shores of an ancient sea, are pyramids and structures that look like an ancient city in the sands of Mars. It's interesting to note, with the face on Mars, that he appears to be wearing a helmet. According to some esoteric sources, in ancient Atlantis, they used a kind of helmet to protect themselves when they went inside the pyramids that were generating power around the world. Inside the heavy electromagnetic fields in the generating chambers of these pyramids, the engineers would wear a protective metal helmet and metal clothing. It is said that the ancient Egyptians then later adopted their own pharaoh headdress after the metal helmets worn by the ancient engineers of the pyramid electrical distribution system. And we now see that, is it possible that the face on Mars is also wearing a helmet similar to the ancient Egyptian helmet, and one that may have come from the grid engineers of ancient Atlantis? So here we see the face and the city and the ancient pyramid in the Cydonia region of Mars. This is the Martian moon Deimos. Mars has two moons, very small. They are Deimos and Phobos. Curiously, the moons, as they move around Mars, move in opposite directions. They have opposite orbits to each other. There we see the Martian moon Phobos. In the background is Mars. Martian moon Phobos, in particular, has been theorized to be some kind of artificial moon or spaceport in orbit around Mars. Here we see a close-up of the Martian moon Phobos. Astronomers have noted with interest the strange parallel striations across the surface you see on the right. Notice how these lines are perfectly parallel. It seems to be a very unusual geological formation. It's also interesting to know the large footprint type giant tracks across the top of the moon that you can see. Some weird dotting or cratering of the surface. The Soviet space probe Phobos 2 got to Mars. It made one orbit around Mars, and as it came back around at its orbit, it photographed this shadow on the surface of Mars. It thought the shadow might be of the Martian moon Phobos, although it's an elongated shadow and could be of a large cigar-shaped aircraft, some sort of tubular spacecraft that was in orbit around Mars. And sure enough, as the Phobos 2 spacecraft turned to photograph the Martian moon Phobos, it took a photo of what appeared to be a long, tubular-shaped craft either coming from or going to the Martian moon Phobos. At this point, the Phobos 2 spacecraft malfunctioned. Some Soviet scientists theorized that the Phobos 2 spacecraft was shot out of orbit after the first orbit of Mars and taking the photograph of the tubular spacecraft coming out behind the Martian moon. This NASA photo of what appears to be an installation on Mars was taken and often used as evidence that some kind of spaceport was on Mars. Notice the bays in this installation that look a little bit like a modern-day airport. That concludes our program tonight on extraterrestrial archaeology. As you can see, there really is evidence for anomalous structures on Mars and our moon, Venus and Mercury, and the outer moons as well. We also see that NASA may be deceiving us in some of the aspects of its space program. Can we really trust everything they tell us? Hopefully we will learn more on this subject of extraterrestrial archaeology. And thank you for joining me on my search tonight.
Well, thanks for joining me on our flight to the moon, Mars, and beyond. I hope that the next time you look up at the night sky in a full moon, you will have a new sense of awe and wonder at the amazing solar system that surrounds our sun. This is David Hatcher Childress saying goodbye and good